film. Every event is strengthened by great partnerships. So before we begin the Q&A, I'd like to thank our event sponsors for tonight. And I also forgot to introduce myself. I'm Deirdre Fitzgerald, and I am the festival programmer for the Monadnock International Film Festival. So our other sponsors for tonight are the American Independent Business Alliance, aka AMIBA, which partnered with Monadnock International Film Festival, aka MONIF, to make tonight's event happen. AMIBA recognizes that watching a film as a community can be a powerful shared experience, and Gather is the perfect film to reframe their Eat Indie local campaign happening this August and September. MONIF has been celebrating the diversity of our world through the power of storytelling and storytellers for a decade, and Gather is the perfect example of this. We hope you can join us September 23rd through 25th in person in Keene, New Hampshire, and September 27th through October 6th online for our 10th annual film festival. To learn more about both those organizations, we'll put the web addresses in the chat for you. So our Eat Indie local partners include the Monadnock Food Co-op, which is a community-owned grocery store in Keene, New Hampshire. Sustainable Business Network of Massachusetts, the nation's first business trade association with a mission of making business a vehicle for social, environmental, and economic change. And Food Connects, delivering local food as well as educational and consulting services aimed at transforming the food system. Finally, before I turn it over to our moderator extraordinaire, Laura Carbonneau of Food Connects, and our esteemed filmmaker and panelist, Sanjay Rawal, please note that due to unforeseen circumstances, Valerie Segrist of Tahoma Peak Solutions is unable to join us tonight, but sends her regrets. We hope to catch up with Valerie soon in a follow-up discussion at the MONIF Annual Film Festival this fall. This Q&A is being recorded and will be available to watch later on this platform and shared through our partner sites in the next few days. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to post it in the chat. You can see that right in the live stream function, and our moderator will be sure to ask Sanjay the question. Without further ado, I'll put you in Laura's capable hands.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thanks again for joining us. As Dee said, my name is Laura Carbonneau, and I am the Marketing and Outreach Manager at Food Connects, and we're so excited for this great lineup that we have tonight. As we open our discussion today, we acknowledge, recognize, and pay respect to the lands that we here in New Hampshire occupy that have been and continue to be the homes of Wabanaki and Abenaki people. And likewise, those joining us from afar that are also occupying other Indigenous lands. We do this to acknowledge the political struggle of Indigenous peoples in asserting their sovereignty and treaty rights. We do this for all of us to feel more connected to the place and land we occupy. We do this to include Indigenous people in the narrative of racial equity and power redistribution. Now, I would like to introduce our guest this evening, give him a virtual round of applause. Today we have Sanjay Rawal, who is an award-winning filmmaker and director of the film Gather. Sanjay has spent 15 years working on human rights campaigns globally. Sanjay's first feature film, Food Chains, in 2014, was produced by Eva Longoria and Eric Schlosser, and with narration by Forest Whitaker. The film won numerous awards and released theatrically in 40 cities by Screen Media and was acquired by Netflix. Sanjay's second effort took a sharp turn into non-traditional filmmaking. Applying narrative cinematic techniques, Sanjay directed a sweeping expedition film. 3100 Run and Become was released theatrically in 20 markets in the US. Sanjay's work has been supported by Ford, Bertha, BritDoc, and many more. His work has won an assortment of honors, including the James Beard Media Award. Thank you for being with us here tonight. And I'm going to get us started with a couple questions. But again, to our audience out there, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them our way. We'll try to get as many of them as we can. So, Sanjay, this is like sort of the big first question I tend to ask, some of my filmmaker friends. But this one I feel like is really important with Gather is, why did you think this film had to be made? Why was it that important?
That's a great question, and thanks again, Laura, and thanks Dee
Of
and
course.
everyone joining. I never felt like I was the right person for this movie. As people may or may not know, that the first documentary film ever made was called Nanook of the North, and it was made by an Anglo-American man, last name Robert Flaherty, who traveled up to the Inuit territories in northern Canada and made a film called Nanook of the North. By many of the local accounts, it was a collaboration film with the local tribe. But I think it's indisputable that that film started an industry whereby people of means, like myself, who can get a camera and a crew together, have gone all over the world and ended up telling other people's stories. And in many cases, not necessarily in the most culturally sensitive ways. And because of this very long history of non-natives going into indigenous communities and telling their stories for them, I hesitated mightily. But the friend of mine who suggested this film as a follow-up to Food Chains, in a sense, like Food Chains was about migrant farm labor and dealt with the commodification of human labor since the dawn of our agricultural economy, the bodies, so to speak, in the extractive agricultural economy. And a friend of mine suggested doing a film on the obverse, the reverse of that, those whose land was taken, stolen, and turned into plantations for that early and still existed agricultural economy. So I didn't think this was my film to make, but my friend said that, she asked me to meet an organization called the First Nations Development Institute, a large philanthropic and development organization of Native Americans based in Colorado, who had been working on the ground in these food issues for 30 or 40 years. And I met with them and we talked about a lot of ideas, and we both pledged to help each other find a better person to make the film. And we never found that person. And the stories seemed so timely that I asked them, and they implored the same to me, that they have a role, the organization First Nations have a role in helping me not make the same mistakes that non-Indigenous people make. And certainly a lot of those mistakes would have been made, all of them really unconscious, but they would have reinforced biases, stereotypes in ways that I never would have wanted to had I been Indigenous myself. So it's a long answer to your question.
Well, it's a really great one because, throughout the process of these filmmakings, it's really important to have the stories told in a very, very authentic way. And so in the process of making this, I'm sure that you've spoke with many more people who actually weren't in the final cut, so to say, of the film. So were there any stories that you encountered throughout the filmmaking process that you wish were included in the film that you weren't able to for whatever reason?
Well, because I was by no dint of my own, I was pretty sensitive to the fact that Indigenous communities have always sort of been exploited for their stories, or there wasn't really enough of a trade-off.
Mm-hmm.
And people who share their stories, to a filmmaker also have an expectation that their story is good enough to be in a film. And when you don't put their story in the film, then it hurts. And I didn't want that to happen. So, at the same time, not every story you hear is, I guess, visual enough for film. It might be better in a newspaper story or a magazine story. Luckily, one of the supporting organizations of the film understood that and gave us a grant so that the stories that we came across that we knew weren't going to make it into the film, we could have Native journalists and Native photographers tell. And those stories are on our website, gather.film. I think we ended up producing about 10 of those. And probably the most interesting of those was, this is really specific. an organization on the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation is about the size of West Virginia, but it has, I think, a population of about 200,000 people, plus or minus a few 10,000s here or there. And it's desert. This one group of Navajo farmers, agriculturalists, they decided to raise cattle, but they wanted to do, which of course is non-indigenous, came from Europe, and cattle can absolutely obliterate a North American environment. I mean, they eat grass to below the roots so that the grasses don't regenerate. There's no symbiotic relationship with much of the flora and cattle. But these Navajo thought that they could raise cattle with their own tribal traditions. And through that kind of environmental sensitivity, they developed a model to graze cattle in the desert, but in a way that did not destroy the ecosystem at all. So it was like free range cattle, so to speak. And they formed a company called Navajo Beef. But because of all the weird FDA regulations about slaughterhouses, they didn't have the money to start a slaughterhouse on their tribal land, and had to ship the cows way off site and have them slaughtered. And it was so expensive, they couldn't actually then ship them back and sell them to schools. So Navajo kids weren't even eating beef raised on Navajo land. But the story was about how they managed to figure out a way to do that and to serve their tribal community food that was being purchased on the reservation. And a lot of our stories had to do with that, people finding ways through the government regulations of serving commodity foods to the people on the reservation, either in schools or in families that were reliant on much poorer quality US government food.
Wow, that I feel like we kind of encounter often in terms of like the tensions between maybe like indigenous or traditional foodways and the corporatization of food in America now, which is, you know, big conglomerates of food system organizations that are maybe not making the best choices. So what's something really interesting, I noticed that within the film, there are a lot of calls to educate the younger generations and pass on traditional ways of growing and consuming food in very intentional and thoughtful ways. And there's a specific call to action from Elsie Dubray to educate the scientific community with traditional knowledge. That like really stuck with me when watching the film. And so what do you see as some of the tension points between food modernization and corporatization of food and traditional foodways, and how can we push past some of those tension points to make a better food system?
That's a great question. I think we first need to begin by reframing who we are in the food system. We call ourselves consumers, but the kind of, you know, the image I get of that is something that continuously has to consume. And doesn't necessarily have a relationship with the environment from which it's drawing the products. So even that word consumer puts us into a frame of mind that's not healthy for planet Earth. But if we consider ourselves stewards, then the relationship is reframed entirely. I mean, in stewardship, there still is an exchange. There's a caloric exchange, but there's a responsibility to the system from which we derive those calories. And there's also the responsibility of a returning gesture or a returning action from the side of the recipient. So it's an understanding that that the give and take is not just with a dollar. The give and take has to be much deeper. The give and take has to not just look at the immediacy of putting something into our mouths and maybe composting the scraps, but we have to look at how to ensure that particular relationship lasts. In many indigenous, nations, that relationship has to be forecast upwards of 7 generations or more. So now we don't really look at ourselves as stewards of a food system. We don't really care about whether our great grandkids are going to have strawberries in the summer. We're really just worried about whether there's a good strawberry or watermelon season for us. And so from that standpoint, if we begin to understand ourselves as stewards, then I think we begin to understand what sort of impact our food decisions really have on the environment. And it helps us to develop a much deeper sense of humility to Mother Earth, to nature, to everybody in the supply chain, in the food chain, farmers, farm workers, meatpacking workers, with an understanding that our expenditure at the end also needs to ensure fairness and equity within those additional nodes or parts of the chain in between.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when you think about the larger food chain, and you mentioned all the different aspects, not just the consumers or the stewards, if we reframe it, but also the workers. And I'm wondering, you kind of alluded to this earlier, but that this is kind of a response to your earlier film, Food Chains. And so I'm wondering, when you were going through the filmmaking process for Gather, like, how much were you looking back at your experience in Food Chains, and what were you drawing from that to inspire you in this film?
It's a great question. In Food Chains, we followed a group of farm workers in a small city in Florida called Immokalee. And they gave themselves the organizational name, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. It's a mouthful, so they shortened it to the CIW. They're primarily comprised of displaced indigenous workers from Guatemala, from southern Mexico, many from Haiti, many from the Dominican Republic, all from very similar village structures. And a decision-making apparatus that's not focused on a leader. Everybody within communities in their original homelands had to make decisions collectively. And so as an organization, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers felt that in order to kind of look really to the future and to kind of eliminate bias and self-interest, they had to organize like their traditional communities and have a group decision-making process. So I saw from there the power of collectives in the food system. And they were in a very, very modern system, the tomato industry in Florida. But when I was in Indian country, in what's colloquially referred to as like tribal nation land or indigenous communities, it was very clear that traditionally the whole community would be involved in the food system, from sharing resources to understanding how to steward things from animal herds to water resources, helping one another for the harvest, essentially making sure that access to food was fair for everybody and available for everybody. And a lot of the food sovereignty work that's being done is specifically around that, to ensure that people have equitable access to the types of calories and foods that they want. And through that process, understand their relationship as indigenous people or as human beings, and their relationship to the land that they were on. And so that same sort of ethos of understanding that we are in a system. And when we say food system, most of us, I don't think, are necessarily conscious of that when we go to a grocery store or even to a farmer's market. We feel like we are consumers within a food system, but we are that system. We are part of that system. We are what can make it terrible for a lot of people, or we are what can make it powerful and accessible for a lot of people. So the similarities between the two films was really in the attitudes of the folks that I got to spend time with.
That's fascinating. And I know we're talking about Gather, but I will make a big plug for anyone out there to watch Food Chains. And also, if you get a chance to read Tomatoland, which is about the coalition that you were mentioning, because both are very, very powerful. So we do have a question from the audience. So Joy is asking if the stories that are on the website will be updated from time to time, and also notes that the stories encourage her to reflect on her own relationship to food, growing food, and the environment.
Thanks for the question, Joy. You know, we were actually really happy that I think we made a little bit of long-lasting impact with the stories. We worked to basically, we commissioned stories from Native journalists and photographers and pitched them to larger outlets like the San Francisco Chronicle, the Atlantic. But there's one particular organization, which I'm sure many of you know about or subscribe to, a publication online called Civil Eats. And out of the collaboration with Civil Eats, I think we produced 2 or 3 stories. And then they actually hired somebody on the indigenous food systems beat, a journalist named Kaylin Goodluck, who actually took photographs for 1 or more of our stories on Gather. So they picked up the ball and they're running with it much faster and kind of more energetically than we ever could.
Well, that's great. And again, another plug to subscribe to that for a lot of great Civil Eats, for a lot of great resources on not only indigenous foodways, but equity in the food system in general. So again, another comment in here, Richard says, powerful film, thank you. I really appreciate how people in the film connected with indigenous groups in the US and even across continents. Did more of these international connections come up? And do you see that as something that the people in the film see as valuable and want more of?
That's a great question. So as you saw, there was one little tangent in the movie between the ancestral guard on the Yurok reservation and the indigenous communities they connected with in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brazil. And as you know, I'm sure, Richard, you know that there's a lot of indigenous environmental organizations around the world that actually share knowledge with each other. They meet, you know, in person and virtually. They help each other understand the successes and failures of their own individual campaigns. And when appropriate, they actually join with each other on those campaigns. Twyla Casador from San Carlos Apache, she has been trading and gathering seeds with Southern Oaxacan indigenous people. She's joined large collectives of matriarchal indigenous societies in South America for their annual agricultural and spiritual based conferences. So we got a chance to really see how alive those connections were when we met our characters. And it was enlightening to me too, because from my experience with the Immokalee workers, they had connections to lower wage working groups all over the world who occupied a similar economic status in their supply chain, whether it was garment workers or whether they were other sorts of agricultural workers or dairy workers in the Northeast, in Vermont and New Hampshire, or construction workers in Texas. So I find that fascinating, the networks that exist in the case of indigenous people that have existed through trade routes for thousands of years, and how they're continuing to be perpetuated and strengthened today.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful thing to think about, how there are so many people across the globe that can connect in this way and have been impacted both positively and negatively around the food system. And you know, we think about what we're doing locally and always wonder, you know, how much are we doing that is making a difference on a larger scale. So I have a question that Jen Risley from the American Independent Business Alliance had put together for us previously that she would have appreciated that I asked. So the American Independent Business Alliance, along with 30 other partners across 19 states, works nationally to build this indie local movement, which is happening this August and September in New Hampshire. August is New Hampshire Eat Local Month. And so she was wondering how we could leverage the film to work and create a more inclusive food systems movement. So it's not just the people, as you were saying really early on, that have the means to be part of this movement, but really include everyone in this movement to create a more equitable food system.
Great question. It's too difficult to try to understand food sovereignty on a national level. And I don't think it actually exists. I mean, even in Indian country, food sovereignty is not the same to each tribe. I mean, there's 500 plus federally recognized tribes in the US and Alaska and Hawaii, and hundreds more, thousands of more that existed pre-contact, pre-colonization. And each had a specific type of food sovereignty that they practiced. So all of these solutions can only be addressed at the hyper local level. Number one, it's an understanding of what plants and food systems, whether they're livestock, whether they're forage goods, whether they're animals in the wild, what those systems are, what those plants and animals are, and what resources they've relied on for thousands or tens of thousands of years, from water to shade, etc. Then it's understanding how we fit into that specific system. And then it's understanding how we can take from that system, whether it's clearing land for livestock or food or foraging, and not take too much. So it's not so much that in this world that we need to always return things to the environment. Like, we just need to make sure that we don't take too much. I mean, that's how life has existed on planet Earth for hundreds of millions of years until now. So it's mainly food sovereignty is first and foremost about understanding the resources available, how you can live in balance with those systems and be happy and healthy. Obviously, in many cases, that means that you don't get access to all the foods you want to at the supermarket all year round. But once people begin developing that fundamental understanding of what the relationship should be like, then we can understand our impact. I mean, tribal communities never existed in isolation. There were things that they didn't have access to, either because it would have destroyed that resource or because they didn't have that resource. So there was always an exchange, there was always trading, there was always movement of goods. Right now, we have a lot more movement of goods into our communities from afar than necessarily we create within our communities. So again, that's the first step, creating more of our food system right down the street, right around the block, and getting as many people in our neighborhoods as involved with that food system as possible.
So you kind of already answered the next question that I had queued up, but I still want to touch on this food sovereignty theme because it's really important. So the other quote that is in the film that really, really stood out to me was, when you have food sovereignty, you are free to be more self-reliant, to grow your own food, to choose the foods you want to eat, choose the foods you want to put in school systems, and really be self-sustaining and sustainable. So the question I, originally had posed was, what does food sovereignty mean to you, and what steps can we take to achieve it? And that obviously is such a huge and massive question. Yeah, exactly. But in that same vein, in this restorative revolution that we're being called to, what do you hope that the viewers will take with them in terms of what food sovereignty should look like? And is there anything like from this film that you want them to take with them in that vein?
Well, so I'm not really sure where everybody watching the film is zooming in from, but I live in Queens, New York City, in a very, very urban area of the United States. And we don't have greenhouse land, we don't have farmland, but we do have a local natural food store that doesn't have the buying power of Trader Joe's or Whole Foods or anything else, but they have knowledge and they're able to stock healthy, affordable foods that the community wants. They're able to specifically get things that the community, the ethnic types of foods, the more exotic types of foods, the more basic types of foods, that drives kind of health in the community. And I volunteer there anywhere between 1 and 2 hours a day, 6 days a week. And that's my contribution to my community's food system. So it doesn't always have to be like fishing for your meal or like hunting an elk in New York City. Like, we just have to look at where we are and where our power is. Like, I don't have the power to go to Trader Joe's and ask them to get specific products that mean something to me. Like, they don't care. But the local stores, even the bodegas, even the delis, like, they'll listen, and they actually serve the community in deeper ways by returning more of that money back to the communities, helping the communities find the choices of their foods that they want, and helping to employ people in the community in healthier ways. So there's different ways to look at the food system and understand where our minimal power can be exerted. And a lot of that, of course, is within school systems as well, because they have a lot of purchasing power. And by getting them to all help all the communities within your city make better food decisions for children, et cetera, they can actually make substantive change in ways that we as individuals, really have no business trying to make.
And we're fortunate, those of us who are tuning in, who are in the Monadnock region and our kind of sister city across the river in Vermont. We have access to a lot of co-ops that do have that independence, and we're able to give them feedback, and they're member owned, and so we can have that ownership within our communities. But we recognize that that's not the case all over, and so we are really unfortunate in that sense. There was one other piece with that I'm just curious about, any follow-up with, the restaurants or any of the stories that were actually featured in the film. Like, have you heard any updates from all the cast of characters that we were able to, connect with while watching it?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to believe how much time has passed. Elsie is now a junior at Stanford. Is she a junior? Yeah, she's a junior, and she might actually be doing her senior year starting in the spring semester of 2023. Nephi's Cafe, we filmed there in January of 2020. Obviously, it had to be shuttered in March of 2020, and White Mountain Apache was one of the harder hit regions in the United States. But that said, the difference between Nephi and a restaurant that might be in a city near you is that Nephi didn't have to necessarily worry about rent, since his facility was on tribal land. And so they were able to resume operations late last fall. They had to rehire and retrain everybody, but the restaurant's doing really, really well. If you search Nephi Craig on the guardian.co.uk website, The Guardian wrote an article about his cafe a couple of days ago. So he's doing really well. Twyla's finding a lot more receptivity in her community and taking a lot more kids out into the land to harvest, to hunt for glostro, for pack rats, and for other types of animals. And the boys, now men, on the Yurok reservation, Sammy's two younger brothers, who were 19 and 17 in the filming of the movie, are now both married and have kids. So Sammy is an uncle twice, and they're all working together. They had some of the most challenging times during the pandemic, because their reservation is hundreds of miles away from any large urban area at the very end of the supply chain. So the stores near them were the first that basically had barren shelves. And the Yurok aren't farmers, but they were forced to be farmers. So Sammy and his crew ended up planting, I think, 70 or 80 gardens within their community in the span of a few months, so that the community could take one more large step towards self-reliance.
Wow, that, when you think about some of the silver linings of the pandemic, gardens, like that increase in gardens is just incredible. And, unfortunate that it came out of this necessity, but now if it's something that they have, that's fantastic. You mentioned, some the Twyla and taking the students out and having more of that interaction. And I just wanted to share that in New Hampshire, the New Hampshire Farm to School and the New Hampshire Indigenous Alliance has a Indigenous Harvest of the Month calendar which is really a fascinating tool that is seasonal, that highlights Indigenous foods in this region. So students in New Hampshire and in the surrounding states can kind of learn about what foods are Indigenous to our regions. And so one of the other questions that we received is it's a question that says, can you ask about the impact of the loss of Indigenous foods due to climate impact, loss of land areas that sustain the growth of particular foods? So what that looks like, as you know, we're talking about now, there's some restoration of some gardens, but what about the loss that they've experienced because of climate and land use?
That's a very important question that probably deserves a smarter person than me. But inherently, it's like most native tribes are not living on their ancestral land. Many were forced to relocate or had the best and most productive areas of their land taken for non-natives. And so many tribes actually don't have access to water. They actually don't have access to the ecosystems that supported them for thousands of years. And because they're not on the land that has the access to resources, they're not able to grow a lot of their traditional food. And because that's been going on for so long, and there's a whole system of forced boarding schools to separate people from their land, forcing them not to learn with elders, but through regular school systems, changing their religion, changing their names, taking their language away from them, punishing them if they spoke their native language. A lot of the cultural knowledge has been taken away as well. And so for many tribes, it's the first step is piecing together what that food system might have been like 70, 80, 90 years ago. So going to elders who are 70 or 80 years old and asking if they remember what was in their grandparents' or great-grandparents' pantries, getting those lists of ingredients, beginning to see if they're still available or if they can start regrowing them or finding the habitats and restoring those habitats. So it's really slow work that will take a generation or more to piece together. And that's just on the kind of the plant side. But if you look at what happened in the Midwest, the decimation of tens of millions of bison, which were the apex animal for all of the Great Plains. The Great Plains were the third largest carbon sink in the world, behind the Arctic tundra and the Amazon rainforest. And that's irreversible. It's like, it's just, you know, buffalo aren't gonna cross Highway 80. They're not gonna, like, you know, it's just not possible. So it's that a lot of native tribes are in this position where they're really trying to address survival with a severe lack of resources, and trying to find ways to reform their cultural practices to a much more limited food system.
Well, thank you. That it's all, as you said, it's a very big topic to cover. You know, that loss of food.
It all boils down to resources. So when people ask, what can we do to support Indigenous food sovereignty? It's really to figure out which tribal nations live near you. They all have websites, and look at the policies that they want to change. Most of the time, it's not like, you know, oh, we want to put a garden in the school. It's like, oh, this river is being dammed, and it might not be affecting you downstream in ways that you realize, but these are the 10 things that are going to happen to you in the next decade. Most of us, when we look at that, the first thought that we would have is like, oh God, I'm going to need to move. But if we take the viewpoint of being stewards, like those tribal nations are, we go, oh, what if I had to stay here for the next 10 generations? What do I need to do to support the protection of these resources? So we can support a lot of Indigenous tribes in those ways by being allies and trying to help in ways that where they want us to help, not necessarily bringing our own ideas of how they need help.
Awesome. Now we have one last question from the audience. This comes from Deborah. And she asks what your favorite new food that you tried during filming was, and did you add any new foods to your regular diet after making the film? And as a foodie, I love this question as well.
Yeah, it's a hard question because I'm vegetarian, and I will share a meal with somebody if it's, you know, culturally important. So it's like I ate, you know, salmon and bison and glosho, not necessarily things I'd reincorporate, but this is what I got out of it. So Twyla, she began her foray into food sovereignty literally by going with a colleague to all the elders that were still alive in the 2010s and interviewing them about their tribal foods or the traditional foods from their grandparents and great-grandparents' pantries. And so I went and asked my mom and dad, who are now in their 80s, if they could remember what they ate in their grandparents' houses in the villages in India. And those commodities I've never seen at an Indian restaurant. We've never cooked like that at home because we didn't have access in the US to traditional red rices. We didn't have access to the very specific millets from my dad's hometown. And I realized that without starting a whole science class, like, look, if you were born above the Arctic Circle and you couldn't digest fats, you died. So we all evolved based on our ability to draw calories from our food system. I mean, human beings can wear a jacket, survive in the north, you know, or in the deep south, take off the jacket, survive around the equator. But it's your specificity to foods that allows you to pass on your genes. So all of us have genetics that were honed for tens of thousands of years to very specific environments. There were almost no human populations except for Ashkenazi Jews that were forced to move from their homelands, you know, within spans of centuries. Most of us stayed in places for hundreds of generations. And we don't know, in many cases, where those hometowns were. I'm lucky because my parents are first generation immigrants, but people who have been displaced from those homelands, whether they're Europe or Asia for tens or dozens of generations, don't know what those practices were. And chances are the food systems there have changed a lot. So what I realized was that my genetic strength is not based on me having access to Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or a co-op. It's based on me trying to understand the food systems that my genes were best adapted to. And so, I mean, I don't eat like that, but I found a couple of ingredients where I go like, I know this is what made my genes strong. And this is what I know my ancestors ate. So that specific way of finding these new foods that I know have a deeper resonance on a genetic level has been really, really fascinating to me.
Wow, that is like an incredible way, and to sum that up, and it reminds me of the story of the Ötzi, the ice man from, you know, northern Italy, who were able to like discover what was in his diet from thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, and how some of those same foods were things that they're still consuming in that region today. And it's just like quite an incredible like wraparound with all of this. So we're getting close to our time, and I really want to thank you for your time and taking time with all of us, and wanted to open it up to you if you had anything else that you wanted to share with our audience here today.
I want to thank you guys all for joining us. And if you have social media, if you're on Instagram, our film's Instagram is Gather Film, and you'll see how you can keep in touch with us and with all of our characters. I mean, I don't do that much, but like our characters, the folks in the film, are constantly doing things that are very, very inspiring. And you'll see who they're following too in Indigenous communities, and you can really see what's what's going on the ground, day by day.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm not sure if Dee's coming back on. There she is.
Hi, that was
Hi.
amazing. We could definitely go on much longer, but I know people are getting tired, so I don't want to push the limits there. But just wanted to thank everybody again and thank our partners and sponsors. And I hope the folks who joined us got a lot out of this, because this was a really amazing conversation. And anyone who did miss it, I hope you have an opportunity to check it out here on the platform. Thanks again, Sanjay. You've been so good to us. I think this is probably the third time we're showing Gather, and the second time we've wrangled you to talk about the film. So, it's something we never get tired of hearing about.
The pleasure is all mine. It's great seeing you guys, and have a great rest of your week.
All right, and I'm going to stop the stream right now. You guys can stay on, and we can close out in a couple seconds. So let me stop that stream.